English translation, 687th Contact, Part 2. Saturday, the 22nd of July, 2017, 2016 hours.
But it should suffice to give a small insight into what is really going on in the EU dictatorship, and especially in Germany with regard to crime, terrorism and criminality, of which the population is largely unaware because the necessary information does not reach the public and is therefore concealed. On the other hand, it is also the case that this keeps the people stupid and dumb, who for the most part are unfortunately uneducated with regard to higher education and do not care about anything. Consequently, they can be manipulated from above, precisely by the politicians and governments, etc., as well as by the religions and sects in every respect, without even noticing this. Unfortunately, the common people also lack a good general education, which leads to the fact that they cannot have their say in all political forms, but have to let the politicians and populists, etc., think for them, in order to then cheerfully agree with and accept their nonsensical proposals, etc. But now I would like to talk about the violent rainy weather that is spreading over the whole of Europe and causing severe flooding, which we too and also your daughter Simyase and I have often talked about. Here I have copied from the Pleiadian Contact Reports, Volume 13, this excerpt from the 594th Contact Conversation on the 1st of September 2014, to recall the whole thing once again, which has already been foreshadowed. Then I want to hear your opinion on what the main causes of flooding are. Of course I know about this, such as soil compaction, droughts and overwatered areas due to continuous rains, etc. Your daughter Simyase spoke about this in the 1970s. And you also spoke about it in 2006, saying that Europe was becoming swampy due to heavy rainfall. Can you perhaps say something more specifically about that, please?
Floods, as they have been occurring all over the world for quite some time now and will continue to do so in the future, are not simply caused by normal rainfall, but by enormous amounts of rain caused by climate change, for which Earth humans are undoubtedly to blame. The origin and the effects of this can only be found in the grievances and degenerating machinations that have been and continue to be caused by massive overpopulation. The degenerations caused by Earth humans with regard to the fauna and flora, as well as the climate and the planet itself, have brought the entire balance of nature into turmoil and to the brink of collapse. As a result of which nature has been reacting for some time according to the given law of causality. This means that the degenerate causes created by Earth humans with regard to nature and the planet, as well as the fauna and flora, are now and have been for some time producing the corresponding effects. A fact which, however, is still denied by the stupid and irresponsible. It does not want to be recognized that it is the Earth humans themselves who are to blame for the climate disaster, because large parts of nature, the climate and the fauna and flora have been destroyed, which has been done by nuclear and toxic contamination, as well as by clearing rainforests, gigantic dams, building cities, destroying landscapes, correcting watercourses, exploiting earth resources and polluting the environment, and so on. But all this is also based on various irrational and irrational factors, such as the irresponsible compaction of the soil with heavy vehicles, as these are used and employed in agriculture and in the soil cultivation industry, etc., in an exuberantly irrational way. Also, the concreting over and asphalting of roads, paths, and other areas promotes all kinds of mischief. Furthermore, floods are also caused by periods of drought, whereby streams, alluvial zones, and other wetlands, as well as lakes and rivers, but also gardens, fields, meadows, forest soils, and fallow land dry out and harden to such an extent that they can no longer absorb or soak up water when there is abundant rainfall. This means that the rain can no longer drain away into the depleted and hardened soil, but is dammed up and leads to flooding. On the other hand, however, large floods are also caused by huge amounts of unusually heavy storm rainfall and by melting snow and glaciers, whereby these masses of water then overflow the streams, lakes, and rivers, penetrate into the land, and flood it. It is not uncommon for the land to already be so saturated by heavy rains and melting snow that the water masses can no longer drain away, accumulate, and also cause flooding. Since overpopulation on Earth has become more and more dangerous to nature, in that floodplains have been built over with houses and roads, etc., and are still being built over, the enormous masses of water caused by abnormal rainfall and storms, as well as by melting snow and glaciers, can no longer flow out into their natural escape routes, such as floodplains built over with houses, roads, buildings, etc. Consequently, these floodplains, which have been built up through human irrationality and irresponsibility and converted into residential areas, are flooded, causing ever more severe damage to human achievements and also costing more and more human lives. This is in addition to all the fauna and flora that has been killed and destroyed and continues to be killed and destroyed by the irrational construction of structures by human beings. And this as a result of the increasing overpopulation and its lack of space, through which the water escape areas, as well as dangerous mountain slopes, volcanic areas, and sea beaches, as well as stream, river, and lake banks, are being built up to dangerously close to the water bodies with housing, etc. If high tides or tsunamis, etc. form, then the shores and beaches are flooded and houses, buildings, and other human achievements are swept into the waters and destroyed. Therefore, proper safety distances from human structures, etc. to water bodies should be maintained. For example, in case of flowing or stagnant water bodies such as streams, rivers, and lakes, a minimum distance of 70 meters to the water bodies should be considered and maintained, depending on the size and dangerousness of the respective water bodies. Furthermore, a minimum height of 3 meters above the highest water level ever measured or to be expected is to be calculated. It is irresponsible to construct dwellings and other buildings, etc., without taking this safety measure into account. In the case of a sea, the minimum safety height for buildings should also be 3 meters above sea level, while the minimum distance to the beach should be calculated as 200 meters. However, these dimensions only apply in relation to seas that are not highly endangered by seaquakes. Otherwise, the minimum height above sea level and the distance to the sea must be calculated, otherwise according to the danger posed by seaquakes and thus by tsunamis. If I remember correctly, your daughter Sim Ya-se said something along these lines back in the 1970s, and you have also spoken about this before. It may well have been about 15 years ago. It is undoubtedly the case that all the predictions are coming true, both those of the prophet Jeremiah, those of my father, as well as yours, which you put in writing and disseminated in the 1940s and 1950s, and also later, to which Asket and later my daughter, Sim Ya-se, Quetzal, and I also contributed quite a bit. Unfortunately, however, all the responsible rulers and media at that time threw everything to the wind, as you say in each case, as a result of which overpopulation has continued to increase without measure, as well as all the resulting destruction, extermination, and destruction of nature, its fauna, flora, waters, forests, and climate. At that time, in the 1950s and 1960s, it would still have been possible to stop the outbreaks of all evils and thus also their effects to a large extent, and to regulate everything in such a way that all the destructive things that are happening today in all areas of nature, fauna, flora, waters, forests, and the climate could have been avoided. If, immediately after your written warnings in the 1940s and 1950s, a worldwide 7-year birth stop had been enacted within the next 15 years, followed by strict birth control, then all the destruction, extermination, and annihilation in all areas of nature and its fauna and flora, as well as in the waters and the climate, as a result of which all the predictions would now not come true, would also have been avoided.
It is not only the present rainstorms that are falling in Europe. For everywhere else in the world, there are also increasingly devastating rain floods, causing immense flooding and damage, which also leads to deaths. There are also severe droughts and water shortages all over the world that bring much disaster, hardship, and misery to human beings. Forest fires in various countries have also become daily occurrences, many of which could have been avoided during all the past decades, just as they could be avoided today. For I think that these could and can only come about because they are not looked after and not tidied up and consequently not kept clean. But the intelligence of many forest owners is not sufficient for this, which also includes states themselves, whereby various of these state and forest authorities are so stupid as to propagate that the forest should not be tidied up for the sake of nature conservation, etc. This is idiotic because the forests are not kept clean. This is idiotic because on the one hand, forests can only burn like blazes because a lot of scrawny undergrowth and fallen timber as well as processing wood covers the forest floors, which then allows everything to burn like blazes. On the other hand, however, it is the case that forest owners are too lazy and irresponsible to clean up the forests, even after felling, and the fact that their tidying work does not earn them any money also plays a role. But in their stupidity, they cannot think about the fact that they suffer a lot of damage in a forest fire, especially financially. Unfortunately, stupidity, laziness, and irresponsibility know no bounds.
What you say has its correctness, because if forests are cared for and thus also tidied up, be it through commercial forest use or through other authoritative proper forest care, then commercial forests can hardly catch fire, neither through arson nor through lightning and the effects of the heat of the sun. The situation is different during droughts, when forests dry out, but this is also only the case when forest soils are uncleared, which allows fires to find sufficient fire food.
For some decades now, so-called forest naturalization has also been practiced, but this mostly refers to European forests only, whereby forests or larger parts of them are left to run wild in order to create forest conditions similar to primeval forests. Although the whole thing has nothing to do with forest neglect, but with letting the naturalness of the forest take its course.
I am aware of that. These are protective forests, not commercial forests.
But commercial forests should be maintained as well as possible and cleared of soil wood, and not only to avoid forest fires, because there are other reasons for having forests free of soil wood. But if I may make a bigger leap now, I would like to get to the ice shelf that is broken off in Antarctica. I have indeed done that before with suffice, whereby we then also observed a magnificent spectacle in the sea on the same round trip, which lasted a little over an hour, when a pack of orcas, killer whales, also called great killer whales and wolves of the seas, chased two great white sharks and then killed and ate them. Though, as I said, I have seen various big icebergs along with your father's suffice, later with Ascot too, but this one, see this newspaper article. I would also like to see this one and take a few steps on it, if possible.
That can be arranged. But unfortunately, I can't fly there with you myself because I come through the gate, and so I have to go back that way. But I will ask Florina or Enjana to take you to the place and let you walk around on the iceberg. However, for that you will have to put on suitable shoes and clothes. Because on the one hand it will be cold, and on the other hand you should wear correct footwear for that, because it would be dangerous in your slippers.
Shoes, of course, I will put on my boots and a jacket. Besides, I do not want to spend an eternity scrambling around on the log, but only a short time to feel something special again. Unfortunately, the climate change caused by the irresponsible machinations of overpopulation is not only causing the poles to break off more and more in the near future, but also to melt rapidly, as is the case with the glaciers in Switzerland and also elsewhere in the world. And this can no longer be stopped, because the steadily increasing heat will turn more and more into heat, from which the human beings, nature and its fauna and flora will also suffer, as is also happening this year. Your father suffice predicted as early as the 1940s that Europe would also be affected, with temperatures in the south in particular reaching up to 50 degrees Celsius, depending on the area. And this would be the case, he said, in contrast to violent storms all over Europe, but how the whole thing would also spread to the whole world and bring much disaster. But thanks for your effort, that I can walk around a bit on the ice block, so I will be happy to wait for one of the girls then. And I don't want to be away from here for more than an hour then either, because I have to do my work so that you can finally call it off. I have missed quite a bit lately, I'm afraid, because I have always had other work getting in the way.
I understand that because no one can do your work for you yet, especially the administrative and financial work, so you have to do it yourself. However, I am always surprised how you can still call up and write down our discussion reports and work on your books. In addition to the bulletins and all the other various publications which you also produce, except for the WZ periodical which you have handed in. And the fact that you can write everything in such a comprehensible way, because you can write better than you can speak, but that doesn't mean that you can't explain everything orally, that not many further explanations are necessary, that is of particular value. But Bernadette is also always fully occupied with work, so she is also working late into the night, just like you. But regarding your wish, it will be in the next few days that you can fly there with Florina or Injana.
That is good, thanks. Yes, it is correct that Bernadette is also involved in all the writing of my books and in the completion of all the publications I produce, and is constantly overloaded with work. In addition to the biography she has to painstakingly compile for my person. The printing work also has to be done, which is usually done by Atlantis, Pius, and for some time now also Marianne and Willem. When the correction work is done, in which Bernadette, Marianne, Daniela, Christian, and partly also Elizabeth Gruber and Bridget, and finally also I are involved. The house font Voice of Aquarius Time is produced by Daniela, with all core group members contributing articles, as some passive members have also been making an effort to contribute articles in this regard for some time. Evi compiles the contact report conversations when I have called up the conversations and written them down, just as she, together with Barbara, is also responsible for the bookkeeping. Evi is also responsible for the packing and dispatch of the periodicals, with all the core group members present helping with the packing. Piero, Michael, Ueli, Daniel, and Patrick manage the entire and quite extensive computer system. But apart from all these activities and duties, there is also housework and work in the grounds, garden, and forest, which, despite all the above-mentioned duties of the individuals, is done by everyone in addition. The women are responsible for the housework, Evi and Daniela for the garden, and the forest work is usually done by Jacobus and Christian, while for Andreas, as a carpenter, various types of work fall into his area. Erhard is generally responsible for permanent painting work, as is Cuneo, but they also do other work, while Madeline, due to her disability, can only work in the house, on Sundays, and selling books. Karen Wallen is responsible for the book and scripture stores, etc., while Karen Meyer helps in the print shop and is also active in the household, as are all the women. So it is to be said that all core group members are involved and cooperate in everything, which makes everything work, because we have built up a good infrastructure, which is the underpinning of all our facilities of a material nature and our entire system of rules and regulations, and which favors and guarantees the functioning of our association economy based on the division of labor. It is therefore an infrastructure created by the FIGU Association which, if it is consistently followed and observed, guarantees the permanent existence of all FIGU goods and the permanent work, as well as the spread of the FIGU mission, and the permanent existence of the FIGU Association itself.
This is all clear to me, while appreciating very much the tireless efforts of all, and expressing my deep thanks to all FIGU members for their cooperation also from my side.
Thanks on behalf of all core group members, but also all passive members. I would also like to express my thanks to all core group and passive members who spend their free time and holidays to work at the center and help to keep everything running with their obligatory and solidary financial contributions. I would also like to have that said clearly once.
Although I already said it, I echo what you said.
Good, thanks.
What we were talking about earlier regarding the heat and warmth, I wanted to mention that it will change from year to year, but it will also increase. In the center itself, however, you will notice rather less of the heat, because it is surrounded by trees, which you have arranged as Quetzal wisely recommended to you, and you have followed his advice. Because of the all-round forestation, a large part of the strong solar radiation is absorbed, which leads to the moderation of the heat because the foliage of the trees and the green plants absorb and process it.
You can say that again, because we are actually noticing that too. Then I would like to come back to US President Trump because you said some time ago that you are still busy with clarifications regarding his election.
There are no new findings so far that I could mention in relation to the election, although plans are secretly being made to drive Trump out of office. Namely, through his political enemies. A special court of inquiry will be convened before which he will be summoned to confront him with allegations of secret election machinations along with Russia, in the hope of removing him from office.
They just will not give it a rest. Just like they will not give it a rest against Russia, which the anti-Russia US government is terrorizing with threats and sanctions and doing everything to ensure that there is discord between the US and Russia, which is also affecting the EU dictatorship, which is of the same anti-Russia mind.
This is undoubtedly so. And the new sanctions that have already been decided will be followed by others that are already being concocted to try to force Russia down, which will fail because the exact opposite will come about. The more the USA provokes, together with the EU dictatorship in ambush, the more the effective new strength of Russia will prove, which has become much more powerful, has undertaken a huge build-up and will also behave and defend itself in a new way against the warmongering machinations of the USA. Neither new embargoes and sanctions, nor threats from the entire West will make any impression on Russia, because it is fully aware of its new strength in every respect, which will cause the USA and the EU dictatorship in particular ever more and greater concern if they do not give up their hostility towards Russia and do not finally strive for peace.
It does not sound like things are going to get any better in the next few years.
That will indeed be the case, because U.S. hostility towards Russia will continue to be stirred up, even increasingly so, and also in connection with President Trump in such a way that he is to be dissuaded from his Russia-friendliness by means of lies, slander, and coercion. His election slogan, America First, is to be implemented by the anti-Trump and anti-Russia in such a way that America will emerge from all U.S. intrigues as the very first world power, and Russia will be completely sidelined to lead a powerless shadow existence. And this is to come about, among other things, by forcing Russia down, whereby certain powerful people in the U.S. government, in various offices and in secret services, who are hostile to Trump, Russia, and Putin, are secretly striving for and pursuing these effective plans, which is also expressed in relation to the Special Court of Inquiry, which will try to confront Trump with Russia-related election fraud machinations. However, this is not enough, because the anti-Russia machinations in the U.S. are fermenting worldwide and in all U.S. states, with the fermenting state in the U.S. population becoming more and more threatening, which is why large parts of the entire citizenry feel endangered, acquire weapons, and stock up on ammunition to go with them.
Typical. I can only say, just typical for that part of the U.S. Americans that neither strives for peace with Russia and is precisely hostile to Russia, nor can desist from its world domination behavior and from playing world police, and also continues to practice the death penalty, which is nothing other than state-sanctioned murder, and thus also a dictatorial arbitrary act.
I also understand that to be the case.
It can't be otherwise. It is also to be said that the entire world situation is already out of joint, so that not only in the USA are gun shops overrun by gun buyers, but also in Switzerland and Germany. And I find that dangerous, because as a rule, the persons buying weapons are those who have no experience whatsoever in dealing with weapons, as a result of which alone a lot of harm can be done.
I am also aware of this, but unfortunately it cannot be changed, because the authorities responsible for firearms licenses negligently issue permits for them.
I also think that those members of the authorities would have to be held jointly responsible if things are done with the weapons that could be avoided by refusing to issue weapons acquisition licenses. But now I would like to ask you whether there are also suicides in your country. Here on Earth, this is, so to speak, an everyday occurrence, for which I argue, as you know, that suicide is an act of cowardice, regardless of the reasons given for such an act. This is in addition to the fact that such a death is also undignified and proves that the human being in question never knew the value of life, because he wasted his life senselessly and was too lazy to deal with life, dying, and death.
Firstly, I can say that suicides do not occur among us, Playaran, because from childhood onwards, the value of life is learnt through appropriate education and training, which of course also deals with life, dying, and death in and of itself. In this respect, every child of understanding age is taught and guided to lead its world of thoughts and feelings on its own. Initiative in such a way that during its lifetime it repeatedly recalls and considers everything that is necessary for life, death, and dying in order to always be aware of the whole. By understanding the whole matter of the value of life, death, and dying, everything that could lead to thoughts of self-dying or suicide is consciously left out. In doing so, everything and every arising of any difficulties with regard to thoughts and feelings is neutralized by consciously working through it mentally, emotionally, and leading it to a result worth living, and thereby not burdening the psyche in any way, which is the fundamental factor of keeping the world of thoughts and feelings healthy, and thus also the feedback with the healthy psyche.
I see, because in this way the psyche cannot be damaged, which is demolished in suicidal persons, whether as a result of alcoholism, depression, drug or medication addiction, fear, lovesickness, pain, some failure or even anger, etc., which are given as reasons for suicide. But in my opinion, there is never a reason for suicide, because in each and every case there is nothing but cowardice behind it.
I have already said that I agree with this. Besides, every suicide is an unworthiness of human beings and life.
I am also of this opinion, but here I have this journal with an article entitled, How to Recognize a Sociopath. For this, here are 20 questions and answers which I can confirm according to the teachings I have received through your father Sfath and through your daughter Simyase, you and Quezal, regarding psychopaths of this kind. Here, however, this psychopathic form is called sociopathy, which is a made-up word from Latin socius, companion, comrade, and ancient Greek pathos, suffering, as I looked it up. It is a term used in Anglo-American psychiatry for a psychiatric disorder primarily of the person's social behavior. In 1909, the term was coined by a Carl Birnbaum, although it was not popularized until after 1930 by a George Partridge. The term, or today's meaning sociopath, refers either to psychopathic persons who have no or only limited ability to feel empathy for fellow human beings, have difficulty, if any, empathizing with them and are unable to weigh up the consequences of their actions. According to another definition, sociopaths are supposedly not psychopaths, but basically capable of empathy, but nevertheless behave antisocially. As a trained doctor, psychologist, and psychiatrist, what do you think about this? Namely that sociopaths are not psychopaths.
That is a misconception because sociopaths, I'm familiar with the term, are also effectively afflicted with a form of psychopathy. I would be interested to know what is written in this article, though.
Of course, you can read here, please.
Ta reads, the article cannot be published because this requires written permission from the author and the publisher.
The whole thing is somewhat banal, but it has its correctness and can therefore be called sociopathy.
Good. Then I would like to address something else that I think can probably be called dissociopathy. The other day I had a long telephone conversation with a worried mother whose son I want to call dissociopathic and psychopathic, which makes me call him a dissociopathic psychopathic personality. Apart from everything else, he is also addicted to alcohol and drugs, and has physically disintegrated to such an extent that he can hardly walk anymore. If I can explain to you the whole thing that the woman complained to me about, but which I don't want to name openly, would it be possible for you to say something about it and explain it?
Of course.
Good. Then I will reproduce the following of the conversation, which the woman told me, and which expresses how badly off her son must be. For about 2 hours I explained various things to the woman, and also suggested certain behaviors to her, whereby I described the characters and the whole behavior of her son as a dissocial psychopathic personality. So then,
A long elaboration. Dear friend, but I can gladly mention some of my knowledge on this, whereby I find the term dissocial psychopathic personality very good and correct and want to keep this designation. However, the whole thing you have explained to me cannot be equated with so-called sociopathy, which refers to psychopathic persons who have no or only a limited ability to feel compassion, have difficulty empathizing with others, and are unable to weigh up the consequences of their actions. What you have said does indeed apply to your created term dissocial psychopathic personality. And if I now elaborate in this regard a series of authoritative behaviors of such a personality, as you have described them in detail, then the whole thing is consistent with what I, for my part, now want to explain. A dissocial psychopathic personality is always geared to impressing and captivating fellow human beings with manipulative attempts and much talk. A dissocial psychopathic personality is hung with a strong self-promotion, boasts about himself and emphasizes the works, actions, and deeds of others as his own, and thus in such a way that he claims them for himself. A dissocial psychopathic personality is cunning and uses this ability to pursue and achieve his own, usually selfish goals. A dissocial psychopathic personality has no empathy for human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, as a result of which it is also incapable of empathy, although it may be able to feign a certain empathy. A dissocial psychopathic personality is incapable of compassion for fellow human beings, for according to its meaning, fallible fellow human beings would have to suffer extremely draconian punishments for wrong actions or deeds, which, however, should not apply equally to the dissocial person for the same actions and deeds, whereby the consequences for one's own wrong and wrongful actions and deeds cannot be weighed. A dissocial psychopathic personality tries to persuade, impress, and in this way exert power over and control his fellow human beings through much talk and one-sided expertise. A dissocial psychopathic personality indulges in indifference, capriciousness, unpunctuality, and negligent to indifferent fulfillment of duty towards fellow human beings. A dissocial psychopathic personality, due to a lack of intelligence, is frighteningly indifferent to what others think of him or her and judges him or her disparagingly as foolish and unworthy of friendship and humanity. A dissocial psychopathic personality is in its self-centeredness extremely selfish. Egocentric, self-serving, egotistical, self-centered, selfish, calculating, and focused exclusively on its own needs, which results in all kinds of disadvantages for other people. A dissocial psychopathic personality is capable of imposing psychological grievances and feelings of guilt on fellow human beings through their moody, negative, boorish, and vulgar behavior because they unconsciously feel that their sense of honor is being attacked. A dissocial psychopathic personality discredits fellow human beings with insults, discriminations, slights, and accuses them of lying, trickery, and distortion of facts. When his or her own recollection fabricates false memories, whereby these accusations are intended to confirm the facts which are asserted as a result of false memories. A dissocial psychopathic personality knows how, without feeling any bad conscience or shame, to always adapt his truth to an appropriate situation and to lie and pretend that he meant exactly what the person was talking about, although he meant something completely different. A dissocial psychopathic personality often feels that they are being treated unfairly or that something offensive is being said against them. So they feel that it is their good right to defend themselves with insults, abuse, and injustice. A dissocial psychopathic personality considers others to be clueless, powerless, and weak, but considers himself to be strong, powerful, invincible, and above life. A dissocial psychopathic personality elevates itself above its fellow human beings and treats them in a thoughtless, insolent, arrogant, often boorish and bossy manner, regarding others not as human beings but as commodities and trying to humiliate them with insults. A dissocial psychopathic personality is not able to maintain long-lasting relationships with other persons. For he is not capable of true love, but only of short-lived, illusory love, which breaks out once here and once there. A dissocial psychopathic personality can fall into a long-lasting, illusory love affair with a particular person, whereby the whole thing often degenerates into stalking. That is to say, the deliberate, repeated, and persistent stalking or harassment of a person whose physical or psychological integrity can be threatened and damaged directly, indirectly, or in the long term. A dissocial psychopathic personality pretends to be outwardly decent, charming and sociable when necessary, contrary to his true inner and outer negative behavior, which is skillfully hidden outside the circle of acquaintances, family, and friends. A dissocial psychopathic personality displays enormous false self-confidence, even to the point of pretentiousness and arrogance, in order to be considered worth something in their circles. A dissocial psychopathic personality likes to take center stage in narratives, events, and factual accounts in order to claim himself as a strong, creditable, and exceptionally knowledgeable person in particular fields. A dissocial psychopathic personality is pathologically oriented towards mistrust and constantly suspects when errors of action or behavior have to be pointed out to him that he will be negatively talked about, insulted, and condemned. A dissocial psychopathic personality, despite weak intelligence, is capable but unwilling to perceive, recognize, or even think about negative consequences of their actions, speeches, deeds, and behavior, let alone remedy them, which can also lead to a complete failure of control in relation to one's own mastery, and from this, under certain circumstances, blindly killing fellow human beings. A dissocial psychopathic personality is absolutely capable, but equally absolutely unwilling, to take responsibility for his own speech, actions, deeds, and behavior because he surrenders to a stupidly impudent and primitive grandeur and lives under the delusion that he can cope with life and existence in his primitive way without any trouble. A dissocial psychopathic personality is absolutely incapable of remorse or shame for his own speech, actions, deeds, and behavior, let alone of bearing the necessary responsibility or even understanding or considering it as a result of lack of intelligence. A dissocial psychopathic personality is constantly aggressive under the surface and, as a result of stupidly insolent self-importance, lives in a constant state of mental war on the one hand with himself without realizing it, and on the other hand also with his fellow human beings and the whole environment. A dissocial psychopathic personality is of the mistaken belief that he or she is the best, most powerful and strongest. Consequently, he or she also orients his or her entire behavior according to this delusion, and accordingly appears to be completely objectionable. A dissocial psychopathic personality does not respect any life that is not worth anything in its own opinion and sense. For in its profound self-importance, primitive self-righteousness, and arrogance, it regards everything as unworthy of life that is not of its primitive form. A dissocial psychopathic personality knows neither modesty nor simplicity, listens to no sound advice, and behaves like a degenerate animal at every possible opportunity. A dissocial psychopathic personality is not worthy of trust, for their interactions are so unpredictable that even the best acquaintance is broken by degeneracy and abusive behavior. And consequently, no true friendship can ever be formed, and as a rule, a dissocial person remains alone in himself and is exploited by other human beings who disregard him. A dissocial psychopathic personality is always focused on self-protective behavior, as well as on his own needs, opinions and ideas, etc., so that in this respect he cannot recognize the self-protective behavior, needs, etc. of his fellow human beings, nor can he assist them in this respect. A dissocial psychopathic personality is in any case also more or less psychopathic, as a result of which he is inclined not only to aggression, but also to hatred and stubbornness, and also to irascibility. A dissocial psychopathic personality does not know honest openness with regard to social coexistence, for he does not fit into a healthy family life, nor into other communities of human connections. A dissocial psychopathic personality twists the words of others, especially in relation to false memories, which are distorted and imagined because the memory is weakened, and this produces false memories, whether in relation to certain things observed, heard, said, done, or situations. Such a dissocial personality is quick to accuse those around him of misrepresenting old events, facts, incidents, etc. But in doing so, he is imputing to them his own false memory and behavior in this respect, which is severely lacking.
A long list, thanks. But when I consider these stated points, what about this? How many of these points does a human being have to exhibit in order to be classified with certainty as a dissocial psychopath?
Even if only 3 of my points apply to a human being, he can be classified with absolute clarity and certainty as a dissocial psychopathic personality without any doubt. In such a case, it is appropriate for persons in the vicinity of such human beings who display their behavior in this way to deal with them correctly in order to protect themselves from them. The most important rule is not to have contact with such persons, but to stay away from them. If this is not possible, the dissocial psychopathic person must be led to believe that his words will be believed, even if his statements and words have been seen through, because this avoids aggression, verbal degenerations, as well as physical violence, quarrels, and hatred. In the case of a dissocial psychopathic person, effective openness is not appropriate but dangerous, since only a person who is psychologically trained on the one hand and fearless and strong enough on the other hand to be able to resist such a person can afford it. If you have to work or live with a dissocial psychopathic personality for work or any other reason, it is a great advantage to take a good psychological course, because this makes it easier to recognize the typical deformities of such a person and to react to them in a more self-protective way.
Thanks for your comments. Then I want to say the additional thing that I forgot in my last statement about insects. Because I also wanted to explain that I found an article in a magazine that said that it was calculated that spiders are the largest carnivores on Earth. It was zoologists from the University of Basel and Lund University who found out that spiders eat about 800 million tons of prey organisms worldwide per year. This while the whole of humanity brings its annual meat consumption to only 400 million tons of fish and meat. Spiders normally feed mainly on insects that occur in the geosphere, that is to say in the entire area of the Earth's solid body and its gaseous envelope or atmosphere extending to the exosphere. The magazine also explained that the spiders arachnida are a class of arthropods and, together with the horseshoe crabs, form the subphylum of the jawed crabs Chelicerata. The spiders also include the web spiders, as well as weaver crabs, scorpions, pseudoscorpions, and mites, including ticks. I also read some books and learned a lot about spiders, which seemed important to me, because I now know that there are about 45,000 species of spiders worldwide, which according to calculations weigh about 25 million tons and are effectively not insects. Although some are also poisonous, but use their venom to paralyze their prey, while other poisonous spiders, usually not in Europe, are also dangerous to human beings. Spiders are extremely important creatures for the ecological balance. They ensure that insects do not multiply endlessly, and they are important bioindicators. And if something is wrong with the environment, they disappear immediately. Spiders are extremely useful life forms because they eat a tremendous number of pests, as is well known, also annoying mosquitoes and flies. Many spiders have a spinning apparatus and use it to build webs, with some spinning a web every day and waiting for an insect to get caught in it. In tropical areas, there are also large spiders called tarantulas, of which there are 144 genera and 941 species in the tarantula family Theraposidae, according to the World Spider Catalog, with the most common growing up to 12 centimeters and the largest up to 30 centimeters, such as the giant tarantula Therapiosa blondi in the rainforest of South America. Certain large specimens of tropical spiders also eat birds as prey in individual cases, as well as lizards, fish, frogs, and even small snakes. The reason for the massive consumption of meat by all spiders is that they were created from the evolutionary development of nature in order to secure the ecological balance of the planet. Because without the spiders, this would tip over because the trillions of different insects and other pests would destroy this balance. Thus, they, along with all other insectivores such as birds, lizards, wasps, and hornets, etc., contribute significantly to reducing the population density of the many kinds of insects. However, as I already explained in my first statement on insects, insects also have important tasks to fulfill with regard to the ecological balance, whereby in the whole of terrestrial insect research, much is still unknown about certain insects, and specifically with regard to insects that are considered harmful. Indeed, insects are central to the functioning of virtually all ecosystems except marine ones. Insects play an important role in nutrient production, as they consume about 50% of the green plant mass and serve as a food source for many animals, vertebrates, and other insects. Effectively, spiders are the most important mid-level predators, namely as carnivores living on herbivores with a meat throughput that is greater than that of all large wild carnivores such as crocodiles, lions, and wolves, etc. combined. And what is also to be said with regard to spiders and insects, beetles as well as worms, maggots, birds of various kinds and scavengers, etc., nutrient recycling is also carried out by all of these, namely by processing plant remains as well as animal, creature, and other life-form carcasses. Bees that pollinate flowers, for example the workers of a beehive, can fly to and pollinate 2-3 million flowers per day, as do also other insects and life forms, but possibly to a lesser extent, although all of them have a central economic importance and from which the human beings benefit. Insects as livestock provide, for example, honeybee and/or silk moth, but insects are also used for biological pest control, with 300 species of insects regularly used for pest control worldwide, such as in greenhouses to control whitefly Trialurodes vaporarium, as well as against parasitic wasps Incarcia formosa. I have also learned that there are also many insects that are pests competing with human beings for food, such as the fruit fly, which causes billions of dollars of damage every year. Furthermore, plagues of locusts should also be mentioned, especially with regard to swarms of African desert locusts, Schistocerca gregaria, which consist of up to 50 billion individuals and cover an area of 1,000 square kilometers, taking 6 hours to fly over when they need to be observed. A large swarm of these grasshoppers eats 4 times the amount of food needed by, for example, the inhabitants of New York and London combined every day. Insects also have a central medical significance. On the one hand, they are carriers of diseases, but on the other hand, they are also useful for obtaining medicines. In a negative sense, insects are carriers of viruses, e.g., yellow fever by mosquitoes, bacteria, pester pathogen by fleas, Plasmodia e.g., malaria by Anopheles mosquitoes, annual expenditure approx. 11 billion CHF flagellates e.g., sleeping sickness by tsetse flies. Components of the bee venom peptide 401, apamin, melatonin, stimulate, for example, the immune system, have an anti-inflammatory effect 100x more effective than hydrocortisone, and prevent the formation of free radicals. Negative or harmful insects also have certain tasks in nature and in its fauna and flora, although these are usually little or not at all known in entomology or entomology as a whole, which would otherwise be necessary to know in order not to simply because they are a nuisance or harmful. senselessly or maliciously eradicate them completely.
That is well and correctly said. Dear friend, for indeed even negative and harmful insects, like other life forms of all genera and species, have their positive sides which they fulfill in nature and its fauna and flora. What I think now, however, with regard to the naming of insects, etc., it would probably be correct if you listed the Latin names in an enclosure in brackets.
That is what I usually do.
Sorry, I know that, but I just wanted to point that out so that you don't forget that.
There is nothing to excuse because you can always ask if you are not afraid to answer. But on a different note, has anything new come up with regard to Earth foreigners, Earth future, and time travelers, past or present, that perhaps some information?
You know, we should not talk about this openly.
Of course, sorry. Was in thought and did not think about it.
Time is running out, Edward, which is why we should cut our conversation short, because I have some work that needs to be done. So if you have no more questions that are important to discuss, then I will leave now.
At least there is nothing more to do at the moment, and besides, it is really late. I will say goodbye to you then, and very many thanks for all you've said and explained.
I also say goodbye to you, dear friend. Farewell.
You too, my friend. Take care, Ptah.